My name is Elena Reyes. I am 30 years old, and I still remember the exact sound the deadbolt made when my husband turned it against me. My mother-in-law threw my diaper bag into a snowbank while I stood on her porch holding my 12-day-old twins. My husband of 3 years handed me divorce papers without saying a single word of comfort first. It was 11 o'clock at night, the middle of a record-breaking Chicago blizzard, and I was standing outside in a bathrobe with two premature babies who weighed barely 5 pounds each. They thought they were getting rid of a broke freelance designer with nowhere to go. What they didn't know was that in 10 days, everything they owned would belong to someone else. Before I get into it, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever had family underestimate exactly what you were capable of, hit that like button, because this one is for you. I never expected marriage to feel like a performance review. I was failing every single day. Marcus Whitlock was 32, a sales director at a mid-sized fintech firm downtown, and when I met him 4 years ago, his ambition felt like confidence rather than the warning sign it turned out to be. That ambition had a source. Her name was Diane, and she measured a person's worth the way an appraiser measures a house: square footage, brand names, resale value. I was an independent product designer who worked from a home office in yoga pants. To Diane, that made me a hobbyist. A woman playing at a career instead of having one. The trouble didn't start with the twins. It started years before them, in small increments so easy to explain away that I spent most of our marriage doing exactly that. Diane would show up unannounced and rearrange my kitchen cabinets to be more efficient. Marcus would repeat her complaints back to me at dinner as though they were his own original thoughts. I have a folder on my old laptop still, labeled Nothing, where I used to write down dates. March 14th, Diane told the caterer at our anniversary dinner that I handled the finances, in a manner of speaking. June 2nd, Marcus asked if I'd considered taking on something more stable now that we were trying for kids. I never showed anyone that folder. I told myself I was keeping it in case I ever needed to make sense of my own marriage to myself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being slowly written out of your own household, one small correction at a time, and I lived inside it for almost 2 years before the twins were even born. I want to walk through a few of those increments because the ending only makes sense if you understand how long the runway was. August of the first year, Diane told me, in front of my own sister, that a real career involved a badge and a desk somewhere. I laughed it off. Marcus laughed along with her. The following spring, Diane started arriving unannounced on weekday mornings, letting herself in with the spare key Marcus had given her without telling me, and rearranging my kitchen to be more functional. I found my spice rack alphabetized twice that year. Both times I said nothing because saying something meant a fight that I would somehow end up apologizing for. By our second anniversary, Marcus had developed a habit of repeating his mother's complaints back to me at dinner, as though they'd occurred to him independently. He'd start sentences with, "I've been thinking," and finish them with something Diane had said to him on the phone 2 hours earlier. I kept a private note on my laptop, in a folder labeled Nothing, where I wrote down dates and quotes without fully admitting to myself why I was doing it. March 14th, our anniversary dinner, Diane told the caterer. I handled the finances, in a manner of speaking, in a tone that made the caterer laugh uncomfortably. June 2nd, Marcus asked, gently, like he was doing me a favor, whether I'd consider something more stable once we started trying for kids. I never showed that folder to anyone. I told myself I was keeping it in case I ever needed to make sense of my own marriage to myself, on a night when the gaslighting got thick enough that I couldn't trust my own memory of what had actually been said. Then I got pregnant with twins, and the small increments turned into something else. Noah and Caleb were born 8 weeks early. They spent 17 days in the NICU, hooked up to monitors that beeped every time their tiny lungs forgot, briefly, how to work. I slept in a recliner next to their isolettes more nights than I slept in my own bed, learning the specific rhythm of alarms that meant something and alarms that meant nothing, learning to change a diaper through the sleeve ports of an isolette without waking a baby smaller than my forearm. Marcus came twice. Both visits lasted under 20 minutes. Diane came once wearing sunglasses indoors and spent most of the visit in the hallway on her phone, describing to someone on the other end how exhausting all of this was for the family. I remember the day the attending doctor cleared the boys to come home. I remember being genuinely, foolishly happy, thinking that whatever had gone wrong between Marcus and me might reset once there were 2 actual children in the house instead of the abstract idea of them. I unpacked 2 matching bassinets I'd assembled myself at 2 in the morning during a contraction-free week, hung soft cotton mobiles over each one, and told myself the hard part was over. You would think bringing 2 babies home would soften a house. In hours, it exposed the load-bearing wall that had been cracking the whole time. Marcus complained that the crying interfered with his sleep before big client meetings. Diane started coming by almost daily, not to hold her grandsons but to inspect the house and report back to Marcus about what she'd found wrong with it. The dishes in the sink, the formula on the counter. Me, in general. It came to a head on a Tuesday in January. The local news had been running storm warnings since dawn, and by evening the temperature had dropped to 5 below. I was in the living room in a fleece robe, trying to settle Caleb while Noah slept fitfully in his bassinet, running on maybe 2 hours of sleep across the previous 48. The front door opened without a knock. Marcus walked in with Diane a step behind him, neither of them bothering to take off their snow-covered boots before crossing my rug. I asked them to keep their voices down. The babies had just gone quiet. Diane laughed, short and sharp, the sound bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. "This is my son's house," she said, stepping closer. "He can speak however loud he wants. You're the one who needs to pack up and get out." I looked at Marcus, waiting for him to correct her. He didn't. He held out a thick manila folder and pressed it into my chest hard enough that the papers spilled onto the floor. "Those are divorce papers," he said, flat, like he was reading a memo. "I'm done playing house with someone who brings nothing to the table. I'm the one climbing the ladder here. I refuse to be dragged down." I couldn't process the words fast enough. We had newborn twins. We had 3 years, and a mortgage, and a life I'd thought, foolishly, was more durable than this. I opened my mouth to argue and Diane didn't give me the chance. She grabbed the diaper bag I'd packed for a doctor's appointment, marched to the front door and threw it as hard as she could into the yard. Bottles and blankets scattered across the snow. "Get out," she screamed. "Take your screaming brats and get out of my son's life. You leech," I begged. I told them it was sub-zero outside, that the boys were premature and fragile, that I just needed until morning to figure something out. Marcus walked to the bassinet, lifted a sleeping Noah and put him in my free arms so I was holding both boys at once, off balance and shaking. Then he gripped my shoulder and pushed me toward the open door. "You're not my problem anymore," he said. "Find a shelter. Get off my property." The door slammed. The deadbolt clicked. I stood on the frozen concrete porch with the wind cutting straight through a bathrobe, holding 2 babies who were already starting to cry in a thin, weakening way I'd never heard from them before. Their lips were turning a shade of blue I recognized from the NICU monitors and never wanted to see again outside a hospital. No keys, no plan. I pulled out my phone with fingers too numb to register the screen properly. I opened a rideshare app, picked the nearest motel, and hit confirm. Payment declined. I tried the card linked to our joint account. Declined again. I opened the banking app itself, and the screen that loaded told me everything I needed to know about how long Marcus had been planning this. The account had been frozen by the primary holder, effective 48 hours earlier. He hadn't reacted to a fight that night. He had scheduled my exile 2 full days in advance, then waited for the coldest night of the year to execute it. I held my sons tighter and felt something close to panic take my throat in both hands. We were going to freeze on the porch of $1 million house. Headlights swept across the yard, cutting through the sideways snow. A black SUV pulled hard into the driveway, tires crunching over fresh drifts, and the man who got out before the engine had fully stopped was Andre, my 34-year-old brother-in-law, a forensic accountant married to Marcus's sister, and the only person in that family who'd ever treated me like I mattered, independent of what I could offer anyone. He must have been driving home from a late shift downtown when he passed the house and saw me on the porch. He slipped once on the ice on his way up the driveway, caught himself, and kept coming. "Elena," he yelled over the wind, already running, already horrified at what he was seeing. "What is happening?" "Marcus kicked us out." My teeth were chattering so hard I could barely form the words. "He froze the accounts. I can't get a car. I can't get anywhere." Andre didn't ask a second question, and he didn't waste a second deciding whether to cross Diane, the one thing every other member of that family had spent years too afraid to do. He stripped off his own coat and put it around my shoulders, gathered both babies into his arms with the practiced ease of a man who'd installed the same model of infant car seat in his own back row for his nieces, and got us into the SUV. The blast of the heater hitting my frozen skin felt like a physical blow. He dialed his wife's number, let it ring once, then hung up before it could connect. "If Vanessa knows," he muttered, gripping the wheel, "Diane knows in 5 minutes. I need to get you out of this neighborhood completely first." He drove us miles across the city, weaving carefully through roads the plows hadn't reached yet, away from the affluent suburb entirely, to a discreet hotel near downtown. He parked near a side entrance to avoid the main lobby, paid for the room with a corporate card Diane could never trace back to either of us, and carried my sons up himself, making sure the heat was cranked and the blackout curtains were pulled shut against the storm before he'd even set his own keys down. He handed me the key cards and a thick fold of cash from his wallet. "Don't call Marcus," he said. "Don't call Vanessa. I'm going to find out what he's hiding. Because a man doesn't do what he just did unless there's something underneath it." Once he left, I laid the boys on the bed, wrapped in comforters, and let myself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the full weight of what had happened. Then I opened my laptop. Here's the thing Marcus never knew about me. For 9 months of my pregnancy, while he complained about my lack of income over dinner, I had been quietly building something in the hours he assumed I was scrolling my phone. A healthcare data framework? A piece of interface architecture I'd designed from the ground up to solve a problem hospitals had been trying to solve for a decade. I'd been in talks with a tech firm for over a year. That night, I opened a secure email from a corporate law firm, subject line, "Final clearance approved." The 10-day holding period on a $15 million acquisition had just gone active. Marcus had thrown me out for being a broke liability. He had no idea he'd just handed the woman he was trying to erase the exact means to erase him back. The rush of that discovery lasted about 90 seconds, because that's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold, not a normal newborn cry. A rasping, effortful whimper. I ran to the bed. Caleb's chest was heaving. I pressed the back of my hand to his forehead and he was burning. Noah was the same. Two premature infants, 12 days old, with immune systems that had just spent 40 minutes exposed to a Chicago blizzard. I stripped them down to their diapers, soaked washcloths in lukewarm water, the way the NICU nurses had drilled into me, and wiped them down while my hands shook. I held them skin to skin against my bare chest and paced the room whispering things that sounded more frightened than soothing. I had $12 in my personal account and a stack of Andre's cash. I needed a thermometer. I needed a doctor. I flagged a cab, paid the driver in hundreds, and got the boys into the nearest 24-hour pediatric urgent care. The ride over is still a blur in my memory, mostly flashing streetlights and the sound of two newborns struggling to pull enough air through lungs that weren't built to handle a blizzard yet. I remember pressing my hand flat against Caleb's chest in the back seat, counting his breaths against the dashboard clock, 22 per minute, then 26, then a jump to 31 that made my stomach drop through the floor of the cab. If you've ever sat in a moving vehicle counting someone else's breaths because you didn't trust yourself to do anything else useful, you already know exactly what that hour felt like, and you have my permission to pause this video and take one for yourself before we keep going. Let me know in the comments if you've ever been there, and if this story is landing the way I hope it is, go ahead and subscribe now, because the part where they find out what I actually am is still 40 minutes away. The triage nurse took one look and skipped us straight past the waiting room. The doctors found severe respiratory inflammation from cold exposure, started nebulizer treatments, and told me the boys had been caught in time. Relief lasted exactly as long as it took an administrative assistant to walk me to the billing desk. I handed the clerk our insurance card, the premium plan funded through Marcus's executive package. It came back inactive. She tried again manually. Inactive again. She looked at her screen, then at me, with the particular discomfort of someone about to say something she wishes she didn't have to. "You and your sons were removed from the primary policy this afternoon," she said quietly. "There's a note on the account." "Read it to me." She hesitated, then did. The note stated that the twins would be reinstated only upon receipt of a notarized custody surrender agreement signed by the mother. I stood at that counter and understood, fully, the shape of what I was up against. This wasn't rage. Marcus had engineered a decision tree. Either I let my premature sons go without treatment, or I signed away my legal rights to access his insurance. He needed me gone cleanly, on paper, so he could hand a new woman the life he was already showing her a preview of. "We have a financial hardship program," the clerk offered gently. "That won't be necessary." I counted out the exact balance in cash and slid it across the counter. "I won't be needing his insurance again. I want to explain something about the next several days because from the outside it must have looked like collapse. It wasn't. It was two lives running in parallel, and only one of them was visible to anyone in the room with me. In the pediatric observation room, I was a mother in borrowed sweatpants, rocking her sick infants, accepting cash from her brother-in-law with trembling, genuine gratitude. On my phone, hidden from view under the edge of a hospital blanket, I was finalizing a cryptographic handover with a legal team that had no idea I was doing it from a plastic chair between two medical cribs. Their lead developer sent an emergency request for a walkthrough of the asymmetric encryption I'd built into the framework, and I typed out an explanation of how the system prevented localized server breaches while gently pressing the back of my hand against Caleb's forehead to check whether his fever had broken yet. I answered questions about cloud load balancing and authentication keys to men who had no idea I was currently sitting in borrowed clothes 3 feet from a nebulizer. A hospital financial counselor came by that same afternoon to inform me that without active insurance, the overnight observation and antibiotics were accumulating charges fast enough that if I couldn't cover a $9,000 deposit, my sons would be moved to an overcrowded public ward. I sat there doing the math in my head. I had access, at that exact moment, to more money than that hospital would see from a single family in a decade, and I could not touch a cent of it without triggering a clause that would unravel the entire acquisition. So I said nothing, and let the counselor believe she was talking to a woman who genuinely didn't have it. Nobody watching me in that room would have believed both versions of my life were true at the same time. That was, in a strange way, exactly the point. The non-disclosure agreement on the acquisition was strict enough that a single leaked word, even to someone I trusted completely, could void the entire deal or bury it in litigation for years. So when Andre arrived in a tailored suit, took one look at the mounting hospital bill, and silently handed his own credit card to the counselor without asking a single question, I let him. It cost me something to watch him do it. I had $15 million clearing in an escrow account, and I let a good man go into debt for children who weren't his, because the alternative was losing the entire war before I'd fired a shot. What I asked him for instead wasn't money, it was his mind. Andre spent his career unraveling corporate fraud for a living, and I had a strong suspicion that a man suddenly moving a CEO's daughter into my house within 24 hours of throwing me into a blizzard wasn't funding that lifestyle on a sales director's salary. Track the money, I told him. He didn't ask why a woman with $12 to her name wanted a forensic audit instead of a loan. He just said, "Give me your old financial backups," and got to work. Hours passed in that hospital room while Andre cross-referenced years of statements on my laptop, and I split my attention between rocking my sons and quietly finalizing the technical handover on my phone. When he finally sat back, the look on his face was one I hadn't seen from him before. "He's bleeding cash," Andre said. "Dummy accounts. Offshore wires. Credit lines maxed to the ceiling. He is completely broke, Elena, and he's spending money that isn't his to keep up an act." He promised to dig deeper, to build something airtight, but he warned me the plan only worked if Marcus and Diane kept believing they'd already won. If they suspected for even a moment that I had an ally with a paper trail, they'd liquidate and vanish before we could use any of it. So I played the part. I let them believe I was exactly as ruined as they needed me to be. The next morning, the double doors at the end of the hallway burst open, and the sound of Diane's heels on linoleum was one I'd have recognized anywhere. She wasn't alone. 2 police officers flanked her, and a stern woman in a beige suit trailed behind, clutching a folder against her chest. "My poor angels," Diane cried, launching straight into performance, reaching for the cribs. I stepped in front of her. "Don't touch them." The woman in beige introduced herself as Rhonda Ellis, a caseworker with Child Protective Services, responding to an emergency welfare call. Diane didn't let her finish. She produced a stack of legal documents and waved them like a flag, describing me as an unhinged, homeless woman who dragged sick infants into a blizzard out of spite, while her son, a stable and successful executive, stood ready to provide everything they needed. Rhonda turned to me, professional and unmoved by theater. "Number other sounds, Isia." The first team Reyes's word. "Reyes, we have a sworn statement that you're unemployed, evicted, and without any means to support 2 infants requiring specialized care. Is that accurate?" Everything in me wanted to open the laptop and show her the $15 million clearance notice sitting 3 days from landing. One screenshot would have ended this instantly. It also would have ended the acquisition, and with it, every ounce of leverage I actually had. I swallowed it. "I'm staying at a hotel," I said, letting my voice sound smaller than it was. "I can provide for them." "Paid for by whom?" Diane cut in. "Ask her where the cash came from. She probably begged on a street corner." Rhonda's pen hovered over a form. "Without proof of stable housing or income, I'm obligated to move forward with a removal assessment." Just as ink met paper, Marcus arrived, disheveled in the expensive way, hair artfully mussed, tie loosened, playing the part of a man undone by worry so convincingly that even the officers softened. He knelt at the crib, buried his face in his hands, and delivered a performance about my mental break that would have won an award if a jury of strangers had been watching instead of a family who already knew better. He asked to speak to me in the hallway. The second the door shut, the grief vanished from his face like a light switching off. $5,000, he said, pressing a folded cashier's check into my pocket. "That's a bus ticket and a few months somewhere cheap. Walk out those doors right now, or I let the state take them, and with your assets, a judge hands them straight to me." My phone buzzed. A text from Andre, a dense summary of state welfare statutes his family law contact had walked him through. I looked up from the screen and something in my face must have changed, because Marcus's smirk faltered before I even said a word. I walked back into the room. I didn't raise my voice. "Ms. Ellis," I said, "under state code, an emergency removal without a judicial warrant requires imminent physical risk. My sons are under 24-hour medical supervision in a secure facility, with licensed staff monitoring their vitals every 15 minutes. That threshold isn't met, and you know it isn't because you wrote it down on your own intake form 10 minutes ago. If you proceed without a judge's signature, I will hold your department personally liable for the violation, and I will make sure it's the kind of liability that ends up in a local news story instead of a filing cabinet." Rhonda's pen went still. Diane opened her mouth to interrupt again, and for the first time since she'd walked into the room, the caseworker held up a hand to silence her instead of me. "Ma'am, I need a moment to review the code section she's referencing." "Take your time," I said, and I meant it because I knew exactly what she'd find. The room went quiet except for the hum of the monitors and the faint rustle of Rhonda flipping through her own binder, cross-checking the statute against a laminated reference card clipped to the inside cover. 2 full minutes passed. I counted them, the way I count most things when the ground under me feels uncertain, because counting is the one thing panic can't take away from you. Finally, she lowered the clipboard, recalculating in real time what kind of woman she was actually dealing with. "You're technically correct," she conceded, "but this only delays things. I'm mandating an emergency custody hearing, Friday 9 a.m., family court. Bring proof of income and housing, or the state awards custody to the father." Marcus's jaw ticked with fury he couldn't voice in front of witnesses. 72 hours? What none of them knew was that my $15 million buyout would clear well before that clock ran out, before the hearing was ever scheduled. While I was still pacing that hospital observation room between fever checks, my laptop chimed with the specific alert tone I'd set up only for Andre's messages. He'd sent a secure file, heavily compressed with a short note attached, pulled this from the estate's security cloud and Marcus's own dashcam. "Brace yourself." I laid the boys back down, draped a light sheet over them, and opened it at the desk. The timestamp in the corner read almost exactly 24 hours after Diane had thrown my diaper bag into the snow. The angle showed the wide front lawn of the house I'd spent 3 years slowly making into a home. A silver sports car pulled into the driveway. Marcus got out first, immaculate in a tailored coat, and jogged around to open the passenger door with a chivalrous flourish. I hadn't seen him perform for me since our first year of dating. A woman stepped out. Paige Whitfield in a pristine white coat, her hair catching the winter light. Marcus popped the trunk and started hauling matching designer luggage up the porch steps. Not a visit, a move-in. The audio, pulled straight from the dash mic, came through with unsettling clarity. Paige paused on the steps, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "Marcus, are you sure about this? It all happened so fast. Where are the babies? Where's your wife?" He set the luggage down, let his shoulders drop into a rehearsed slump, and delivered a performance I recognized instantly because I'd watched him rehearse smaller versions of it at our own dinner table for years. "Don't worry about her," he said. "She's a delusional ex. Motherhood broke her completely. She lost her mind and walked out in the middle of the night, left the babies behind." Paige gasped and pressed a gloved hand to her mouth. "Oh my God, that's horrific." "It is," Marcus agreed, stepping closer, resting his hands on her shoulders. "But I had to step up. I'm all those boys have now. And having you here gives me the strength to get through it." I sat frozen at that desk for a long moment, the laptop's glow the only light in the room. He hadn't just thrown his premature sons into a blizzard. Less than a day later, he was standing in the same driveway, spinning it into a story about his own heroism for an audience who would never think to check. That was the moment the fear finally, fully left my body. Not the fear of being broke. Not the fear of the courtroom that hadn't even been scheduled yet. Just fear generally, the low-grade hum of it I'd been carrying for 3 years without naming it. In its place was something colder and far more useful. He wanted me erased so cleanly that nobody would ever ask what happened to me. Fine. I would let him believe, for exactly as long as it served me, that he'd gotten his wish. Andre found me a modest extended-stay hotel 3 blocks from the pediatric ward, paid in cash under his own name. I'd barely set my bag down when the pounding started on the door. Through the peephole, I saw Vanessa, Marcus's younger sister and Andre's wife, pacing the hallway with her fists clenched. She shoved past me the moment I opened the door. "You are a monster," she said, voice shaking. "I knew you were desperate, but I never thought you were evil." I let her finish. Marcus had clearly fed her a full script. I'd drained our accounts, neglected sick children, dragged them into a storm out of spite, and was now extorting him for money while he had a breakdown over his sons. She called me a leech living off Andre's charity. Vanessa, you have no idea what you're talking about, I said quietly. Your brother is lying to you. To Diane? To Paige. She swung at me. Before her hand landed, Andre stepped through the door he'd let himself into with his own key, caught her wrist mid-air, and physically put himself between us. Sit down, he told her in a voice I'd never heard him use before. Your brother is a fraud, and you're going to sit in that chair and look at the truth, or I walk out of this marriage tonight. Vanessa sank into the chair, stunned. Andre pulled the same forensic stack he'd shown me and laid it in front of her. He walked her through the maxed credit lines, the shell corporations, the second mortgage Marcus had secretly taken against our marital home to fund a $200,000 sports car and jewelry meant to convince a billionaire's daughter he belonged in her world. Then he pulled the document that broke her completely. A private wealth management statement, but not in Marcus's name. Read the account holder, Andre said. Vanessa's voice cracked as she read her own mother's name off the page. Marcus had forged power of attorney 6 months earlier and had been systematically draining Diane's retirement accounts, disguising the theft as routine management to fund a fantasy life for a woman he'd known less than a year. Vanessa didn't cry the way her mother cried, with practiced, camera-ready tears. She sobbed the way a person sobs when a lifelong belief collapses all at once. When she finally looked up, the loyalty that had sent her here to slap me was gone, replaced by something cold and clear. I'm sorry, she said. I believed every word he said. What do you need me to do? Nothing visible, Andre told her. Ga home, play the loyal sister. Keep Diane calm and Marcus confident. We need 3 days of silence before this hearing. I can do that, Vanessa said, and something in the set of her shoulders told me she meant it. We were still sitting with the weight of that conversation when 3 phones buzzed at once, an identical chime. Vanessa opened hers first, and gold confetti animation cascaded across the screen beneath elegant script. You have got to be kidding me, she whispered. Marcus and Paige joyfully invite you to celebrate their engagement. Saturday evening, the Whitfield Grand Ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton. Black tie, a hosted bar, imported caviar, a live jazz ensemble. A 6-figure party, funded, as Andre pointed out flatly, with money stolen from his own mother's retirement fund. He tried to have his newborn sons taken from their mother yesterday, Vanessa said, and tomorrow he's serving champagne. I looked at the date, 24 hours after the custody hearing. Let him have his party, I said. Let him put on the tuxedo. We're not going to stop him in a quiet courtroom and call it finished. We're going to let him stand up in that ballroom and make his toast. Friday morning, I walked into courtroom 4B with a leather portfolio and nothing else. Marcus arrived flanked by Preston Kane, a litigator with a reputation for theatrical cruelty and a 6-figure retainer that, unbeknownst to him, his client could no longer actually cover. Diane trailed behind, handkerchief already primed, dressed for a funeral she hadn't realized was her own. Vanessa sat quietly in the gallery beside Andre, playing her part so convincingly that even I had to remind myself she was on my side. Judge Marsh called the hearing to order with the flat efficiency of someone who'd heard every version of every family's worst day and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. Preston didn't waste a second. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and launched into a narrative that painted me as a woman who had, without provocation, kidnapped 2 fragile infants from a loving, stable father and dragged them into a life-threatening storm out of spite. We are not here to discuss a difference in parenting philosophy, Your Honor, he said, pacing in front of the bench. We are here because of gross, undeniable negligence. He walked a printed bank statement to the clerk with the flourish of a man delivering a closing argument to a jury instead of handing paper to a judge. Exhibit A. The respondent's personal account balance 3 days ago, $12. She exposed 2 premature infants requiring supplemental oxygen to sub-zero temperatures with $12 to her name and nowhere to take them. That is not a custody dispute. That is imminent danger. Judge Marsh studied the statement, her expression unreadable, and made a note. Preston called Diane to the stand next. She took the oath with a trembling hand and gave a performance that would have moved me if I hadn't spent 3 years watching her rehearse smaller versions of it at dinner parties. I tried so hard to help her, she said, dabbing at dry eyes. Marcus tried to keep the family together, but Elena has always been volatile. She never truly wanted to be a mother. She saw him as a paycheck, and the moment he tried to protect his children's future, she snapped and took them from him. I sat still through all of it, hands folded, and let the lies pile up on the official record uncontested. Every sentence they added under oath was another sentence I'd get to hand back to them later, time-stamped and notarized. I needed them fully committed to the story before I took it apart. When Judge Marsh finally turned to me, I stood, Your Honor, I don't dispute the balance in that account. I do dispute why it was there. My husband drained and isolated it deliberately to manufacture the exact crisis being used against me today. As of 3 minutes ago, a corporate escrow hold cleared, giving me access to $15 million from the sale of a software framework I built. But that isn't why we're here. We're here because this entire emergency order rests on a fabrication, and I'd like to call my witness. Andre Vance, forensic accountant. Marcus turned around in his chair, confusion cracking through his composure for the first time all morning. Andre walked past their table entirely, swore the oath, and took the stand with the unhurried calm of a man who audits liars for a living and has simply never found them all that intimidating. "Still, Mr. Vance," Judge Marsh said, "you're the petitioner's brother-in-law and you're testifying for the respondent. That's an unusual arrangement." "I'm testifying for the numbers, Your Honor," Andre said. "I'm a licensed forensic accountant. Over the past 2 days, I conducted a full audit of Marcus Whitlock's finances, credit obligations, and asset holdings. The picture of stability presented to this court this morning is a complete fabrication. Why is us, Mr. are disconnected in your project and your frame? Whitlock is, functionally and legally, insolvent." Preston shot to his feet. "Question. This witness wasn't disclosed. His claims are unsubstantiated and highly prejudicial. I have routing numbers, loan origination signatures, and frozen credit alerts right here," Andre said, tapping the folder without raising his voice. "Time-stamped, legally obtained banking records. I'm happy to walk the court through each one." Judge Marsh waved Preston back into his seat. "Overruled. Bailiff, bring those to the bench." Andre laid it out the way he'd laid it out for Vanessa 2 nights earlier, in order, without embellishment. He described the forged signatures on the second mortgage that had gutted the equity I'd spent 3 years helping build. He described the $200,000 sports car purchased under a shell corporation. He described the credit lines maxed against their limits and defaulted for non-payment as of that morning. And then he described the retirement account, the one that wasn't in Marcus's name at all, and Diane clamped both hands over her mouth so hard her knuckles went white. "If this court grants him custody," Andre finished, "these 2 infants would be placed in a house currently entering foreclosure, in the care of a man who is, as of this audit, facing a credible risk of federal indictment for wire fraud and embezzlement." Judge Marsh set the documents down slowly and looked at Marcus the way you look at something you've stuffed in. "Still, Mr. Vance, you presented this man to my court as a pillar of stability while he sits on the edge of federal charges. This hearing is over. The emergency order is dismissed. Wells, Mrs. Carr, Reyes retains full custody. I'm ordering an independent audit and an immediate freeze on the respondent's remaining assets." The gavel came down. I gathered my portfolio and walked out. Marcus caught up with me in the marble corridor outside, locking my pact with a hand against the wall. "You think you accomplished anything in there?" he hissed. "A temporary freeze means nothing. Tomorrow night I'm marrying into a family whose wealth will erase every debt I have. I'll come back for those boys and bury you." He shoved past me, and I let him go. My phone buzzed against my thigh. I pulled it out and read the notification twice to be sure. The escrow hold had lifted. $15 million, fully cleared, fully mine. Andre found me a moment later, watching Marcus disappear around the corner. "He genuinely thinks that party is a shield," he said. "He just bragged about it to my face," I said. "He also mentioned the second mortgage is in default. Find out who's holding that note." Andre checked his files. "A collection agency picked it up last week. They're filing foreclosure Monday morning. I want it. Set up a blind trust. Buy the debt today, whatever premium it takes." His mouth curved into something close to a smile. "You'd become his creditor. You'd own the paper on his house. Did you?" "Exactly. He thinks he's walking into that ballroom a billionaire. I want him waking up Monday to find out I own the roof over his head." The rest of that Saturday passed in a strange, suspended quiet. I spent the morning at the hospital signing the discharge paperwork for 2 boys who were, for the first time in 10 days, entirely healthy, their color back, their lungs clear on the final scan. I spent the afternoon with Andre finalizing the paperwork on the mortgage purchase, watching a blind trust I'd set up 48 hours earlier quietly become the legal owner of a house I used to live in and had just been told to beg my way back into. And I spent an hour, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit, standing in a boutique dressing room, choosing a gown I had zero intention of enjoying, because the entire point of it was armor, not celebration. Andre offered to come with me to the gala. I told him no. This part had to be mine. By Saturday evening, the Ritz-Carlton ballroom looked like a museum built entirely out of borrowed money. White orchids draped over every surface, filling the air with a sweetness so heavy it bordered on cloying. A 15-piece jazz ensemble played from a velvet stage. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated with caviar and vintage champagne, every ounce of it paid for with funds stolen from a woman who didn't yet know she was ruined. Ice sculptures glistened under 3 crystal chandeliers. It was, by any objective measure, a beautiful party. It was also, line item by line item, a crime scene with a string quartet. Marcus moved through the room like he owned the building, a diamond watch catching the light every time he raised a glass to toast some minor local politician. Paige clung to his arm, radiant and entirely unaware that her engagement ring represented another defaulted credit line. She had no idea her fairy tale had been financed the same way a house of cards gets built, one increasingly desperate lie stacked on the last. Diane worked the room in emerald silk that cost more than most people's cars, playing the sophisticated matriarch to a crowd that had no idea she was, at that exact moment, one missed payment from losing the roof over her own head. The real target of the evening stood near the private bar, Charles Whitfield, Paige's father, a self-made tech billionaire who did not suffer fools and rarely stayed anywhere longer than his own schedule dictated. Marcus and Diane flanked him, dropping industry language, angling openly for a vacant executive vice president seat inside Charles's company. "I've always believed aggressive expansion needs a steady hand at the wheel," Marcus said, swirling his drink, radiating the exact brand of manufactured confidence he used to rehearse in front of our bathroom mirror. "My own portfolio has seen real growth this quarter. I know when to leverage assets and when to strike. I see that same potential in your European division." Diane chimed in on cue, inflating a resume built entirely out of air. "He's being modest, Charles. Marcus has a brilliant mind for acquisitions. Exactly the kind of visionary blood your company deserves at the executive level." Charles listened, nodded, sipped his scotch, and gave away nothing. Marcus, mistaking silence for agreement, lifted his glass to toast the future he assumed was already his. The doors at the back of the ballroom opened before the toast could land. The band faltered. Conversation died in a wave that moved across the room like weather. I stepped through, in a floor-length midnight gown with no ornamentation, flanked by 2 attorneys in matching charcoal suits carrying identical portfolios. I did not look like a woman coming to make a scene. I looked like someone arriving to close a deal. Marcus's face drained of color. Diane's fork clattered against her plate. Charles set down his scotch, watching with the sharp attention of a man who could smell a power shift from across a room. Marcus grabbed Diane by the elbow and crossed the ballroom to meet me before I could take another step toward the crowd, forcing him to make the walk instead of the other way around. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, low enough to keep it from the guests. "This is a private event. I'll have you removed." Diane stepped up beside him, looking me over. "Did you rent that dress with your last $12? You don't belong here." Like the Don as a half of them. My attorneys closed the small gap between us, and Marcus faltered, then pulled out his phone to call security. He didn't get the chance to dial. A ripple moved through the crowd as Charles Whitfield crossed the room himself, walking straight past Marcus's outstretched hand without a glance, and stopped in front of me with a wide, genuine smile. "Elena," he said, loud enough to carry. "I was starting to think your lawyers had you buried in paperwork all night." "The deal took precision, Charles," I said, shaking his hand. "But it's done." Marcus made a sound like something breaking internally. Charles turned to the room and raised his voice. "For 3 years, my acquisition team chased a piece of software that outperformed anything currently on the market. We finally closed on it an hour ago, $15 million, and the architect behind it didn't just take the cash. She took equity. Please raise a glass to Elena Reyes, the newest partner at Whitfield Technologies, and as of tonight, its largest individual shareholder." Marcus's knees actually buckled. He caught himself on a cocktail table. Diane grabbed a chair for support, doing the math on what I now possessed compared to what her family was quietly losing. I stepped forward and set a heavy black folder on the table in front of Charles and Paige. "A welcome gift for my new partner," I said. "That's a certified forensic audit. It documents exactly how the man wearing your daughter's ring forged signatures to gut the equity in our marital home, and exactly which routing numbers he used to drain his own mother's retirement fund to pay for tonight." Paige tore the folder open, and I watched her face lose all its color as she read. She ripped the ring off her finger and threw it at Marcus's chest. "You are a fraud," she said, voice cracking into something close to a scream. Marcus turned to Charles, pleading, calling it a cash flow issue, a temporary restructuring, the kind of thing that happened to every growing portfolio. Charles didn't raise his voice. He picked the folder back up off the table himself, flipped through the executive summary Andre's team had prepared, and read it in full silence while the entire ballroom waited, nobody quite brave enough to resume their conversations. When he finally closed it, he handed it to his own head of security rather than back to Marcus, and looked at the man who was supposed to become his son-in-law the way you look at something you've already decided to throw away. "The engagement is over," Charles said, loud enough to carry to the back of the room. "As of this moment, you're terminated from every contract, every consulting role, and every board seat associated with my company. You will never speak to my daughter again. And you will never set foot in one of my buildings again." Marcus lunged, not at Charles but toward me, and got exactly 2 steps before hotel security tackled him to the floor. He was still shouting when the sirens outside started, red and blue light bleeding through the ballroom windows. "I dispatched the police the moment my legal team verified the documents you sent ahead," Charles told the stunned room. "I don't just fire thieves. I have them arrested." Officers took Marcus into custody in front of every guest he'd spent the night trying to impress. 4 security guards had already wrestled him to the marble floor once, his tuxedo tearing at the shoulder seam, before the cuffs went on and he was hauled upright. He screamed my name twice on the way out. He didn't look at Paige at all. I stood there and let the sound of the sirens outside grow louder through the ballroom windows, red and blue light sliding across the crystal chandeliers, and I felt nothing that resembled triumph. Mostly I felt tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. I turned to find Diane still slumped in a gilded chair, the woman who terrorized me for 3 years reduced to something small and gray in the space of 10 minutes. I walked over, my attorney at my side, and had him place a second stack of documents in her lap. "Those are the deeds and default notices on your house," I told her, keeping my voice level. "Your son leveraged it to fund tonight. It went into default 72 hours ago. I bought the debt this morning through a private trust. I own the paper on your home now, every brick of it." "You can't," she whispered. "It's been in our family for decades." 10 days ago, I said, "you stood in that foyer and watched me beg for one night of shelter for your own grandsons, and you told me to get out into the snow because we weren't your problem anymore. You said this was your son's house, and he could speak however loud he wanted. I promised myself, standing on that porch, that you would eventually feel that exact same cold. You have 2 hours to pack what fits in one suitcase. If anything of yours is still inside when the clock hits midnight, I'll have the police remove you the same way they just removed him." Tears cut through her makeup, leaving dark, uneven tracks down her face. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely old. "Where am I supposed to go? I have nothing left." I thought about answering that. I thought about telling her that I'd asked myself the same question on a porch in a blizzard with 2 dying infants in my arms, and no one had bothered to answer me either. I didn't say any of it. There was nothing left to argue about and no version of this conversation that ended with either of us feeling better. I turned and walked toward the exit, my attorneys falling into step beside me, and I did not look back to see whether she'd started packing. Marcus is serving 15 years in a federal facility for wire fraud and embezzlement. He mops cafeteria floors in an orange jumpsuit that smells permanently of industrial bleach, a long way from the ballrooms he used to glide through with a practiced smile and a rehearsed pitch. From what Andre has been able to piece together through court filings, he spends most of his limited phone privileges calling old business contacts who no longer accept the charges. Diane lives in a motel outside Joliet, dodging collection calls on a prepaid phone, having co-signed enough of her son's fraudulent credit lines to go down alongside him. The friends who filled that ballroom stopped returning her calls the week the story hit the papers. I don't know what she does with her days now. I've deliberately stopped trying to find out. Some doors, once you've closed them, are meant to stay closed, and I've made my peace with the fact that she will never apologize, because people who see cruelty as a management style rarely recognize it as something that needs apologizing for. Vanessa is a different story. It took months, a lot of careful, unhurried conversation, and one very long night where she finally told me, unprompted, exactly how much she'd let herself not see over the years. I'm not going to pretend we're close in the way sisters are supposed to be close, but she shows up. She remembers the boy's allergies without being told twice. That counts for something, and I've decided to let it. I still own the house. I gutted it top to bottom over the following year, tore out the heavy velvet drapes and the dark paneling Diane had spent decades curating, and let actual daylight into every room for what I suspect was the first time in that home's history. It doesn't feel like a monument to anyone's ego anymore, It feels like a place where Noah and Caleb run laps around the kitchen island while Andre chases them with a wooden salad bowl held just out of reach, roaring like a poorly cast movie monster. And Vanessa sits at the counter narrating his babysitting technique like a sports commentator having the best night of her year. I stood at the bay window last winter and watched the season's first snow begin to fall on that same porch, and for a moment I was back there again, 12 days postpartum, holding two dying babies against a body that had nothing left to give them, certain my entire life had just ended on that stretch of frozen concrete. Then I turned around and looked at the actual loud, warm scene happening in my own kitchen, and the memory lost its grip on me, the way memories eventually do, when you've finally built something strong enough to stand next to them. Blood is not a guarantee of anything. It's biology and nothing more. The people who matter are the ones who show up in the blizzard, not the ones who wait to see whether you're worth the trip once you're warm again on your own. If someone in your life ever proved they'd only stand beside you when it was convenient, I hope you remember, clearly, who actually showed up in the cold. Tell me about them in the comments.